So I want to add yet another angle and perspective, which is the subjective point of view. There has been all this desire for agencies and planners to promote equity, but then a lot of confusion and lack of clarity on ideas to pursue. And in this kind of plurality and complication, I think we really need to tune into what people think, what they view as fair, equitable. And so I will present a study of what actual writers of transit in Chicago feel is their allocation, what their ideal view are of different principles of how to distribute the transit service. So really tuning into people and their perspective. So I want to justify this focus on subjective normative views and subjective ideas of fairness. Why? Because it's not really the predominant sort of mainstream view. So I'm going to extract bits and pieces from philosophical arguments and the current literature to support why this is important. There isn't really a lively literature here. It's very, very marginal to date. So I also hope I get a lot of good feedback because this work is very new and kind of evolving. So it's a perfect pitch for this workshop too, to see, if you agree with me that we need to study subjective experiences, which is inherently difficult, how does that fit into our already quite messy framework of how to promote equity? Is it just adding more mud to the machinery, so to say? I also want to show you actual empirical results from a relatively large study with real writers in Chicago so that you can get a sense of how this works in practice. So most agencies will acknowledge, begrudgingly perhaps, that equity is fairly difficult to define, or they will rush ahead and have their own definitions of equity, and there's quite a lot of confusion in our field. And partly that is because equity isn't really a neutral, once and for all, simple framework. It has a lot of connotations of subjectivity, or what seems fair and just, and there's a lot of visceral ways in which we think of this. So Karl Martens kind of introduced us all to this field by saying any equity framework or system that we want to promote has to have clear ideas about these 3 points, right? What are the things, accessibility, pollution, etc. What are the things we're trying to analyze how to distribute? Who are the people that we care about, that we might want to favor, or that we might want to keep in particular regard? And what are the distributional principles? And I would argue the distributional principles is the part that we really struggle with, right? That's the hard one to nail down, that we have had most disagreement about. And also, we have to think really carefully in domain specificity here, right? So I will talk about transit today. Many of us are interested in other topics. We need to think really carefully about what are the metrics for all of these 3 layers that are transit specific, that are kind of reflecting the views and visions and values of different agencies and of people as well, right? So it could be things like accessibility to important destinations. It could be about the amount of your budget that you spend for transit, fees, etc. Transit agencies are doing a really good job, usually if you look through the documentation, to identify communities or people of particular interest or concern. So I think we have pretty clear views of that. The indicator about what's principles, there it gets pretty muddy again, right? So we see things like minority populations or priority populations should have no worse experience than others when we invest, or they should be in a certain kind of arbitrarily set threshold, or we should prioritize service in these neighborhoods, but these neighborhoods are often identified in an aggregate spatial way, so it's fairly difficult to get down to the granular details. I will argue that there's also a 4th point here that we need to spend more time on, and I hope me and Tara Bills will both talk about this, which is a system of institutions, rules, structure that we can actually use to implement this in practice. It's one thing to talk about these principles, but it's another to actually make it reality in particular environments for particular systems, right? And I think the subjective aspect is really important if we want to do that, because it has to fit with people's idea of what equity is. So this is my very kind of selective view of the literature to give you an idea of how we have been discussing about different kind of points of morality in transportation so far. This is not systematic, I handpicked it, but just to highlight that some have really gone very broad. We have a few review studies that really kind of look through an enormous amount of different philosophical principles to try to discern the merit, the value for transportation research, etc. And in Pereira's case, they really highlight capability and Rawlsian principles, and they kind of merge them together into a proposed framework. We have heard from Karl Martens directly, and we can see a lot of connections between frameworks that are relatively similar, like capability approaches and sufficientarianism that focuses more on removing barriers to be able to live a full life, or needs-oriented frameworks, which inherently accepts and embraces differences in treatment. And we can also see some confusion about terms from vertical and horizontal equity we see a lot of, which really kind of ties in with other frameworks. So it's kind of a lively, evolving, still to have its final shape literature. So to bring a little bit of order here, I propose this funnel diagram. The size of the funnel is kind of reflecting minimalist and maximalist approaches. So we can think of minimalist, sort of rights to freedom, anti-government intervention, pro-freedom ideas as kind of minimalist, right? They're more conservative, they're less distributive, they're kind of like let the market do its thing. And then kind of go up the funnel. Utilitarian principles are really what's behind transportation assessment in general. So we think of sometimes compensatory frameworks, sometimes utility-based frameworks, where sometimes we have Hicksian compensation, other times not. But we really think of sort of equality and then heeding people's preferences. What do they care about? What are they willing to pay for? We don't really have a lot of effort, a lot of emphasis on what happens if somebody's hypermobility or high willingness to pay it decreases opportunities or freedom for others, and we don't have really good ways of dealing with that. Equality and justice seem to be kind of what the literature is pushing us towards, and what a lot of the pronunciations that we see from agencies are about. But this is also where we have a lot of challenges in really nailing down the terms. So equality has to do sometimes with the quality of what we assign to people, sometimes with the outcome, so there's a little bit of tension there. There's not always a clear standard of what it is that we should be able to achieve. It's somewhat agnostic to people's pre-existing or historical differences, whereas the kind of highest level or the most ambitious, the most redistributive principles at the end, I kind of put together. I don't know if you agree, Carol, but I put some capabilities and roles theory kind of together here, because whether it comes from the perspective of addressing needs or the difference principles, they are very open to promoting just outcomes by carefully assessing individual or communities' differential opportunities to partake in a good life.
Sorry, in which sense is the word just meant?
Sorry.
Clarification. The word just, in
yes.
which sense is that meant here?
Fair. So
just
kind of
okay.
morally optimal,
okay.
Which will...
Why is that a critique?
What?
Why is that a critique?
Because defining what is just is a bit tricky, because we have sufficientarianism approaches, which really just get people up to like the bare minimum, and then it's over to the market, etc. So kind of where is it enough, and what kind of base allocation that you were given, whether it's bad luck, whether it's disabilities, whether it's making bad choices throughout your life, like which one should we be correcting for?
Just to clarify, I thought just was meant in the sense of only. So,
no, fair, or...
No, this is important. You have to be careful about the word.
No, absolutely. I was very scared putting together these slides.
So why a funnel?
The funnel is about, we often talk about libertarian as a minimalist approach, so it's least number of interventions. And the funnel really, it's not really a moral judgment, it's more about how much redistribution, how much action, how much policies we should be putting into place. And we sometimes say a maximalist approach is the one that's for more redistribution versus a minimalist approach. So it's not really a judgment on which one is more correct. I think different principles might work in different domains, right? Or there can be a mix of principles.
I have just some problems with the yellow.
With the what?
The yellow.
The
rest is quite clear. Not utilitarian.
Oh, okay.
The funnel. I mean, I understand the red, the blue, and the purple. The yellow...
Like they would be on the same scale? Like the width of the funnel would be the same here? Yeah, potentially, yeah.
What about it? Because libertarians have multiple meanings.
Yeah.
Politics, individualism.
Yeah.
Basically, which one is
I'm thinking like Locke and Smith, kind of a traditional view of libertarian, which is not necessarily having no interventions or no public schooling or no kind of state support, but it's giving a lot of emphasis to individual freedom to pursue a life of meaning. So, and it might not be a perfect funnel, but it helps maybe bring a little bit of clarity compared to this. Yeah.
Funnel, because
Yeah.
what is the meaning of the funnel? More specificity or
Less equity.
Oh.
Less equity.
less effort?
So this is minimalist. So do less, because what we really care about is what actions we are promoting by the different principles, right? So clearly there is no single principle of equity. I think we've all absorbed this. If there's one fact that we have absorbed from this, I think it's there's a lot of nuance in how we define equity. But something that I want to stress here is the subjective aspect, which is we need to understand transportation needs and we need to understand people's preferences as a really important aspect of defining equity. So a couple of things here to draw on is we already heard about spheres of justice, so we need to have a kind of a separate assessment of every domain of life to understand the justice principles, and we can't just have a kind of a blanket justice principle. Martha Nussbaum came up with 10 different capabilities that are core for people to live a good life, and there's one or a few that kind of pertain to mobility and autonomy and freedom to move. But she also stressed at the same time, even though she had this list, she also stressed that we need to have a thick concession of capabilities, meaning it must be adapted to different environment, different context, different culture, right? So we'll leave a little bit of that discretionary power, which means we care about locally what people care about and what they think. And Dworkin's envy test, as to briefly explain it, it's this concept that he creates a hypothetical auction and assigns goods to people depending on their own ambition and their own kind of base endowment of capabilities. And at the end of that market, when everybody has kind of engaged in free exchange or in a market exchange, there should be no envy. And envy is not a feeling, it's more the idea that you shouldn't be kind of willing to flip a switch and take somebody else's position because of some kind of unfairness in the system, right? So just because you were, less safe when you were, refusing to wear a helmet when you were biking, etc., and ended up in an accident, that doesn't mean that you should be necessarily compensated for that because you engage in a more risky behavior, right? So there's a nuance there of really caring about what the personal experiences is. There is no kind of universal set of principles there. And Alex Carner has done a lot of work to disentangle and analyze equity principles from kind of top to bottom, from planning agent and advocacy groups all the way down to people, and highlights that we can't just kind of rely on simple state principles and big pronunciation and different rights declarations, but we need to kind of trickle it down and really look at what it is that people care about, involve them in process, procedural justice, etc. So society matters a great deal. Right, and mobility is kind of seeping into all of these approaches as, status and autonomy or freedom of choice, access to opportunities through the capabilities approach, or thinking of accessibility as kind of a locally defined value, right, which could have different meanings for different people. So this is something I use when I teach to undergraduate students about equity to kind of, again, show this flow of differences of an efficiency-based approach, which kind of, puts resources where they will be most used. Let's think of a bike sharing scheme that's put where people are more willing to use it or to pay, has more resources to pay for it. Equality, it's more kind of blanket spreading it out. Equity might be more corrective or bringing it into neighborhoods that have had no investment so far. But I want to emphasize this fourth part, which you don't talk a lot about, which is the experience of fairness and equity, what others are getting, what we are getting in our community, etc. That really matters. So we've seen that in Chicago in many cases, for instance, with bike sharing expansion, of lack of attention to, buy-in, to informing people, to having them be part of the process, and that matters. And actually systems remain underutilized even when equity initiatives are taken because there isn't this care and attention to people and their preferences. So we've seen a lot of Lorentz curves in this talk, but throughout the talks, right? So we all.
To my talk at the moment.
So we love quantitative approaches, right? And it's much harder when we go into qualitative territory. This is just an example of a recent study we did in Chicago where we interviewed seniors throughout the city or throughout disadvantaged neighborhoods in the city to see how they were navigating transportation and health access. And this comes out of our qualitative content analysis of this data and to find these categories, right? So this is strictly qualitative work. So finally, the subjective nature of equity really comes down to this. I think, at least I believe that equity is a normative concept. It's not an absolute, one meaning that goes for all. It is shaped by individual and societal ideals, and then we need to think really carefully about the thing we are trying to allocate, whether it's accessibility or accessibility via transit. It might have different meanings and different status and different subjective nuances. So finally, I also want to stress, every single group that we might want to study, even if we study them as a group and accept that concept, will have a very different idea of equity, right? We are a community of researchers. We have a particular idea of equity, which might or may not be consistent with what people believe or what planners believe, etc. And this can be challenging because we don't really have a way to reconcile this. So to go in towards the transit angle here, we have a pretty good view of what agencies say. There's pretty strong, declarations and planning documents available for us to look at. So we know what agencies think, and they typically have statements such as this. There has been a recognition from the Mineta Transportation Institute that these big charters and declarations aren't really enough. We need to really have more details to be able to implement this. And there's a few studies about user behavior, which is a little bit closer to what I will present, which is if people think that a service is more fair, they're more likely to vote for it in referendums or support it. If for transit case, if people think that transit is equally distributed between your own area and others, they're more likely to find it to be of good service quality, which is kind of interesting. And then indirectly, that would lead to more transit use. Still pretty tentative, but we find some similar findings. So in the public participation and policy literature, we often see a ladder of public participation. There are different theories that kind of describe how we move up this ladder and how the different relations of advocacy and persuasion and coercion work throughout this ladder. So there's a rich literature here. But I think from our own readings, we can have a pretty clear idea about the regulations. They're easy to access and read. We know what transit authorities and planning agencies think. Typically, they have very locationally based, usually quite progressive views of equity. But as Karl Martens and others have noted, there's quite a lot of lack of clarity, and it's difficult to operationalize these ideas. We know what advocacy groups said. We just heard about advocacy groups as a good kind of approximation or representation of what people on the ground are feeling and thinking about a problem. So this is really important. They can put pressure on agencies. They can represent individuals. But it can be quite hard to get all the way down to individual users and understand.
Amanda,
yeah.
What do you mean location-based equity analysis?
I mean that the majority of MPOs that have done analysis have done it by zones. So they say an area with a particular racial composition gets more or less of the service. They use public data, which is more readily available, and so settle for a more kind of aggregate spatial view of equity rather than individual. So it doesn't really get down to the level of individual experiences. So what I want to do is talk about transit equity from the transit user perspective, talk about fairness, transit privilege, meaning how much you're getting compared to others, and how I will present a model of normative preferences as well, which is maybe the trickiest part of this, where we came up with equity-oriented statements and asked people which one they agreed with, and we see what determinants there are for agreeing with these statements. So I'm expecting some pushback here because this is really hard to do, to get this right. So we have these 3 research questions, and importantly, this is kind of a work in progress, is also, are there relationships? So if people feel, for instance, that they're more towards aggressive redistribution policy of justice, do they also perceive lack of fairness for themselves or others? Are they kind of activated or behaving differently in other domains? Or maybe refusing to use a service because it is inequitable, etc. So can it kind of shape other important transit behaviors that we care about? So here are the questions. And these are really designed by my co-author, Amy Hofstra, who kind of drew on the literature. It's a little bit similar to that funnel of different ideas. And this was a statement that was presented. So transit should provide, and then do you agree with one of these statements? And they are roughly representing a particular ideal. So feel free to disagree. This is tricky work to do.
We have a big picture question. So on the previous slide, are these things focused sort of on what makes people happy? Is that sort of an important underlying thought?
It is.
For example, somebody could clearly perceive something as unfair, but not be unhappy about it. Right. And things like that.
So you could say, like, if maybe they have a lower equity standard, they could agree that society should be unfair,
for example,
right?
Or they are better off, and therefore I perceive it's unfair, but I don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm on the better
So
side, right?
we're getting to some of that because we ask about satisfaction, which is kind of tied to how happy you are with the service. And I will show you that
These questions are of perceived fairness without judgment of how happy it makes people or not. This is really just how do people
Oh, this
perceive
is on
fair
its
or not.
own. You'll see the exact questions.
Okay, great.
So just looking at raw data, we'll see the questions. Yeah.
The 4 options you show now is an operationalization of the first research question.
This is the third. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the operation. This is the one that's harder to explain and to wrap your head around, or that you might disagree with more. So I wanted to really put it out there.
And the others you're going to show still?
Yes, I will. So this study is done in Chicago. You saw most of this from Hani's presentation.
How is number 2 and 4 different? With service, as much service as people
Yeah,
need,
utilitarian is a little bit
more service to those in need.
Yeah. So this is more in line with people with disabilities or particular needs, and this
But
is
if you are going to provide what they're using, presumably that's what they need.
Yeah. Utilitarian is tricky because we didn't want to be kind of merging in with this willingness to pay. So it's kind of in ordinary circumstances you get as much as you need versus kind of giving extra attention, maybe a discount or a particular on-demand service or something to a group in need.
That's true, but then it goes back, they're going to have to use it.
Yeah.
That makes it number 2.
Yeah. No, you're right.
It's the word demand there.
Sorry?
Why did you use the word demand for the third one, utilitarian one? It would be the logical word.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point. See, it's very tricky to get every wording right because you're asking this to normal people.
And also you don't know how people interpret the word
Right,
demand.
right, exactly, yeah.
I wouldn't collect need necessarily to disability.
Right.
In general, to not being able to move.
Yeah, it is a question how to get to the principle rather than the very specific situation. So Hani already presented this. So we have 3 main agencies: suburban bus, metro, which is more high-income commuter, suburban demand, and then CTA, which is kind of a capillary service. And this is just to give you an idea of the mapping. We talk a lot about active mobility and ride-hailing, but that's really something that's concentrated in the downtown area. When we look at transit, of course, it serves the whole region of Chicago. However, unevenly, we might have trouble or challenges with how it's serving people, especially west and south side have difficulty getting to the rail system and the fast service that is more capillary and kind of staying in the center.
It's a share of use, it's not supply.
This is percent commuting. This is actual usage, yeah. So you would have to kind of compare it to the map to get the idea. But what we know from experience is that there's complaints about accessibility and intention to extend the railway southwards and to have better access on the west side. We can see that it's serving more than just higher income individuals, although there is a correlation on the north side with income and transit usage. So we're using 2,600 responses from people that was collected by the Regional Transit Authority. This is a quarterly study that they do where they kind of track people, especially in the post-COVID era, where they're trying to understand a lot of changing values, changing ridership patterns, changing motivations for riding, perceptions of safety, etc. So this question is about fairness, comparative service or privilege, and the different norms were inserted in one of these waves, but we only have a one-off, so we can't really track changes yet, but we are hoping to maybe reintroduce this in a later stage and see how it's changing. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we can see that we have a little bit of older adults and then with pretty big underrepresentation of people of color compared to Chicago's composition or to ridership, because Chicago is about 1/3 Latino, 1/3 Black, 1/3 white, and we have majority white respondents here. So we do have a little bit of a skew in representation. So these are the 3 questions just looking at the raw data. So to give you an idea of what the exact question is and what the raw data looks like. So the transit system in Chicago is unfairly distributed, I don't know, or fairly distributed. Yeah.
So given that, can you control for that, or are these results
We
biased?
could wait,
But they're not weighted here.
they're not weighted yet, partly because the traditional weights that transit had isn't really applicable because most of the choice riders have left transit and have remote or flexible works and haven't come back. And the composition is kind of somewhat warped right now, and they're trying to get the choice or more privileged riders back that have more options, but it hasn't happened yet. So we're in this kind of regime of 60% ridership compared to pre-pandemic still. So it is a bit of a transition period, so it's a little harder to weigh the data, but that is a good point.
Is
Yeah.
that a household sample?
Sorry?
How do they recruit the respondents?
These are riders. So people, yeah, these are all riders. Yeah, yeah. It's online, but it's from the roster of riders that they get from the 3 agencies. So it's a mix of the 3 agencies. Yeah. So that's why we might have a skew from people that are, very unhappy with transit, and maybe people that are very supportive of transit. So majority think, or the biggest group think, that transit is unfairly distributed. We know, we'll look at the model of this in a moment. Quite a lot of people are uncertain, so 33% don't really feel like they know. Transit privilege, so compared to others, most people think they get about as much transit as others, and the second rating is getting more. 25 think that they are getting less. And when we did comparative statistics, a chi-square test, this is tied, so having less service is tied to being Black, lower income, and the South region, which has often been acknowledged to be kind of a transit desert, or at least underserved transit-wise.
There's no contradiction with the previous answer. They look very similar. I would expect, if you believe there is a fair distribution, you receive as much. So why
they're so different?
Consistent? I mean, if I believe that the transit system is fairly distributed, I think I receive second question. Second, I'm in the 40%.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Empirical.
Yeah. But the difference is that this is individual and the other one is system-wide. So there's a little bit of a gap there, right? It's not the exact same question.
First question, I think, is very difficult to answer.
It is very difficult to answer, right? Because you have to think about, how much do you know about other people's service quality, right? It is perceptual and it might be biased.
This is I think, actually pretty common when you survey. So I know from my university when we survey, do you feel included in the university or in the department?
Yeah.
And do you think others do?
Yeah.
And everyone, basically, the vast majority of people say, I feel included, but I think that others aren't.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think this is pretty common, that people there's this empathy towards, I'm fine, but I don't think everyone else is doing as well, or is treated fairly necessarily.
Right, and there is a lot of debates about equity and fairness in Chicago. We have a very strong, movement of advocacy. Around transit also. Yeah, yeah.
I just wonder what you mean by receive. When I look at that word, is it what access I have or how much I use?
Service.
So, but I can have access to it, but I don't use it.
Right. So it's available to you, right? But you may not take advantage of it. It is but it's not real accessibility to destinations in the sense of what we talked about earlier, right?
But there's also
But people might misunderstand.
Sorry?
There's also fare involved.
Yes,
People
right.
think it's expensive.
Right.
To them,
So
it's not fair.
there's a lot of challenges of how do you design service. There has been some grievances in the community that we focus too much on travel time or service, not enough on cost and pricing, and a lot of constituents have added discounts in different ways, or free transit, like Marco was going to look at, right? So that is a factor we haven't really studied. So here's a ladder, right, that you may or may not agree on the wording of, but we see that there's a fair even break between the three levels, and then quite a lot less interest in this market or ability to pay principle. But we'll look at model results of that, so you'll see.
I assume you did not use those terms for
Sorry?
the respondents.
No, these are recoded. Yeah. So this is recoded. This is what they see, and this is what is recoded by us. Yeah. So this is what I'm showing to you. Yeah, we're not believing that any person on the street will be well versed in philosophical terminology per se, right? So we're trying to bring it down to earth by a more everyday wording. But it is, again, it's hard to ask about, right? How do you get to people's norms? So we have this cycle of fairness in distribution, which we treated as a multinomial logit model. So there's three alternatives with no order structure. And we looked at social and spatial explanatory variables, transit performance or service quality, and those two equity constructs as well, and how they link together. So we can see that some of the social demographics kind of mimic what we know about disadvantage in general in the literature. So women, people with disabilities kind of agree with this fact that they themselves receive less fair transit service. Or they're also more alert to unfairness. So they're kind of on both sides of this, because fairness and unfairness isn't necessarily two sides of the same coin. It could be different constructs too, how people view it. White people, so people who are not of color, who are overrepresented in our sample, didn't have a clear idea, right? So they were either more likely to see that it was, so they were basically more likely to belong in the I don't know camp and really don't have an opinion. So that's kind of a little bit of a disconnect from general literature that we see. And we didn't find some of the variables we were expecting, like car ownership, to be significant here. So interestingly, a lot of you asked about satisfaction with service and how this links in. So we can see if people see a lot of barriers in terms of travel time, reliability, lack of frequency, they also think that it's unfair, right? So poor service kind of translates into a perception of unfairness, which makes a lot of sense. And you had a question about, are they happier? So satisfaction is usually used as a proxy for being happy with the service. It's not entirely perfect. We've actually found that ridership has a negative correlation with satisfaction. So less satisfied people ride more and vice versa. So it's probably something that's evolving with the pandemic. But we do see that if you're more satisfied with the service overall, you do perceive more fairness, which seems to be consistent. And then this is pretty important for agencies themselves. If you are aware of improvements being done to the system, so efforts on behalf of the agency, if you're noticing them, then you perceive more fairness. So informing people that you are making efforts and kind of thinking about information transmission can be really important. Because the perception of fairness and the perception of equal investment, for instance, is shaped by communication, it's shaped by what you're hearing. So transit privilege and transit supply differences, fairness norms seem to be tied to transit supply in a pretty interesting way. So like you were saying, Grazia, like when we look individually, this actually does seem to make sense mostly, that it is consistent even though the rates look kind of off, right? In terms of looking at norms, if you have higher standards, the redistributive and egalitarian, so the two top ladder rungs, you're more likely to perceive unfairness, which seems like you're more attuned or you're more aware of these issues. With a pay-to-play, so the kind of market-based allocation, you actually think the system is fair, which makes sense, right? So you feel like it's good enough as it is, right? Because it's based on payment principles. So it does seem like norms of allocation, so your individual norms, shapes how you view system fairness. Yeah.
So the familiarity and the race are present in both those two alternatives, but some of the others are not.
Oh, so this is always the same. They're all controlled for at the same time. But yeah, we could look for interactions. So we haven't done that yet. So lastly, we are doing an analysis of, yes?
I just had a question about the last slide.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's a way to take away from this. I think there's people's, like what they believe to be like the right fairness, and there's what they perceive in their outcomes. And those could be quite different, right? Like some might, in theory, think they want some, very, like, everything goes to those in needs, but then they end up with no transit and they're like, oh, something's like wrong in the system, right? And I was wondering if there's a way to tease those connections out of this data, or...
We're not able to because we don't have that question, but I agree that different domains might have different principles. Like I might believe that health should be allocated according to need, but something else should be using market principle, etc. So it would be nice to have a kind of bottom-up definition of like who do you think transit should go to if you had like if you could redesign the system from scratch or something more creative like that. We've thought a lot about how to ask these questions, and like everything we come up with always has a lot of holes. Also, you don't want to expect too much work or effort on part of respondents. You have to keep this very snappy, and so it is challenging to ask about. But you're right. We don't really get to like what do you think would be the best way to, allocate resources in this particular system.
Well, I mean, the first question is kind of that, right?
Yeah.
It's like redistributive, egalitarian market. And then I was just interested that, like if they're more likely to perceive unfairness, is this because it is currently this redistributive system?
Oh, got it. Okay,
not getting as much as they thought they would,
okay.
Or
Yeah, so one thing we want to do is kind of couple this up with what reality says, like whatever transit agencies think is good service, whether travel time performance or accessibility, we could compare this and we could see if there, where is the mismatch, who is kind of perceiving the reality of their, disadvantage or advantage, and who is kind of is at odds with it. Yeah, honey.
Do you have questions on perceived quality of service?
Yeah, yeah.
This is mostly quantity and.
Yeah, so you mean this is too quantitative, or?
Yeah, I guess frequency would be one.
Okay.
Of this, and you have reliability.
There's quite a lot. Yeah, there's quite a lot of service quality.
Perceived safety.
Yeah, we have those. There is quite a lot of questions about enforcement, safety. Adverse events, like bad things happen to you in transit and experiences of various kinds.
I would think there would be correlation.
Yeah.
Between sort of the fairness side of it and the quality of.
Right. So that's what we're trying to go towards, to understand how much the experience of transit, like what is it that shapes your fairness, and like getting good service in terms of frequency. But if it's violent and dirty, for instance, it might not be really good service, right? So it's more nuanced than that.
And there's one general question about transit is what the transit agencies ask every.
Yes, right. But
you just added your 3 questions.
Yes.
So that's what you could do.
Yes, that's our limitation. So we can advocate for doing it again. That would be interesting, especially because norms are changing rather quickly, and investments are changing rather quickly. So to analyze preferences in this domain, we tried some different modeling approaches. Everything looked kind of muddy and complicated. So we went for a more less deterministic, more probabilistic approach, which is latent class modeling. So this is a finite mixture approach. Think of it as like cluster modeling, but we have parameters and we have model testing strategies to decide if our cluster makes sense. So from the exploratory work, even though it was a bit inconclusive, we have this idea that in the redistributive class, we probably will have people that are also linked to unfairness. Women tend to be more towards these more progressive ideals, younger, and those that have more supply, so more to share, right? So those are the things that came up in exploratory work. Not everything was borne out in the model. These two classes were hard to pinpoint, partly because they're kind of close to each other. Maybe they're part of the same funnel, like Garcia was saying. So these were hard to characterize. And then the market, the small share that believed in the market principle, they had pretty clear determinants. Income, being male, and not being a person of color, not being black, which I think fits pretty well with the literature. So if we just run the model on a simple class assignment, we can already see that each class is dominated by one of the questions, but there is more going on in each class, right? The people aren't just one ideal and nothing else, so that's a good insight. And then when we add all these explanatory variables, we can basically see that if you look at the likelihood of being of stating that this is a good principle and the class belonging, you can see that each of them are kind of driven or shaped by one idea, one concept, but then also by others. So people kind of mix them together because they can actually choose two. And then we can look at the demographic profile. So what we see is there are two classes that are really crisp. The bottom end and the top end, so the most extreme classes, are easily characterized. So this really confirmed what we saw. We call them the suburbanites because in some other modeling we saw that they are also living further from the center and maybe not as interested in transit service. So they have personal privilege and they believe in market and to some degree utilitarian allocation belief. The advocacy groups actually had wealth. So these demographics of these two groups are actually pretty similar, but their beliefs are opposite, right? So there's personal privilege to some degree, but belief in redistribution, so kind of sharing your wealth or sharing what you have or allocating it to others that need it more. The tricky ones are the second and the third, the middle class, the 2 and the 3. You can see that their belief systems are pretty different, but their demographics are almost identical, right? So there are not a lot to distinguish them in terms of just looking at their demographic profile, but their beliefs are fairly different. So this is our current naming of this. This is kind of a work in progress. So egalitarians are female, low income, being disadvantaged in terms of service. So you could say that they have some level of privilege in terms of group belonging, but they believe in this redistribution. And then this is the most split up class. They have kind of a dual belief system. They're quite similar profile, but then it seems like they're more practical. So they're kind of thinking about their own needs and the need for redistributing to their own group. And a few of the variables were non-significant, so we couldn't fit locational, like where you are in the city or where you travel, on top of these because it was too correlated. And we know that Chicago is a very segregated city, so income, race, and transit supply are very, very clustered together. All right.
So the suburban women and the sort of lower income males, right? They were not defining these groups. So why was that? Was it really like split evenly across all 4 classes?
So the share of people, they're pretty distributed.
Yeah. It's just remarkable that the division between gender and the division between income is aligned, right? Between the 2 classes.
Yeah.
I mean, can that be explained? It's really striking.
I mean, we're gonna continue looking more at the service quality aspects here because we don't have them yet. This is more of a demographic assignment model, which was, it's easily observable so that you could plan policy around, but you could also think of other aspects like experiences and service quality belief and, perceptions of safety and other things. So to summarize, in our fairness analysis, we could see that there seems to be some distinction between what's fair and unfairness and fairness isn't opposites of each other. There were some nuances that came out in that model. And if you think that your service quality is poor, then you also think that it's unfair. And if you have more advanced or, let's say, higher ladder equity norms, you also are more attuned to perceiving either fairness or unfairness. So you kind of have clear ideas about what you think. In the normative analysis, we could see these 2 very crisp classes, the other 2 more nuanced, but kind of a similar demographic profile leading to very different ideals for redistribution, which is interesting. So you can't just look at somebody's identity and know what they think because it seems to be shaped by something else. And we did see some connections between these constructs of fairness, normative beliefs, and relative supply. So discussion points are as follows. I think I have. No.
You've had a lot of questions.
Okay. All right. So to conclude, we need more rigor in general in defining normative principles of equity and what it is that we really want. I think we're getting towards that in this context. And we also need to think carefully about the context, meaning the good that we are distributing and people's values around that good. So this plurality around the different factors, the different principles, and the different stakeholders throughout the ladder, and even differences among people, is difficult to reconcile. It actually adds complexity to this problem, that we already have a complex problem. Do we need this added complexity? I believe yes, that we need to account for this, partly because if you are creating equity-enhancing policies and people don't believe you are, or don't feel or share that opinion, or think that you're being too aggressive, for instance, about equity policies and disagree on the merit, that's important to know, right? So I think we can't ignore this plurality. Do preferences matter? I think it's really hard to capture, but I do think preferences matter if we find the right tool. We did see here that perceptions of fairness, norms around equity are tied to experiences, to how much you're given in a system. We had a way to ask these questions. I think we can improve and do more on how we ask these questions. Maybe we want to talk more about outcomes. Maybe we want to talk about accessibility, or maybe we want to allow people to identify which outcomes are important for them. And then we have the big problem that hopefully Thierry will help us with, is implementation. So how do we get this through the funnel all the way up to decision makers again? So future research, I really want to link this perceptual layer that we saw today with objective reality. So transit agents have a number of different metrics that they use to say that service is good or bad in different areas. So it can be transit access time, a number of stops close to people, or in a particular zip code, etc. So if we compare this, can we kind of get a sense for differences? Also, if people have these different normative beliefs, what does that mean? Will they use the service more or less? Will they vote to support initiatives? Will they go in all the way in for participatory budgeting that is redistributive, etc.? Will they, give up their taxes for different causes? So, what does it mean in practice? And I think we need to kind of connect with a lot of what you all are doing in, agent-based models and operations research. If people care about equity in different ways, how does that enter into models? Limitations, a lot of you noticed, there's challenging work to do. How should we describe norms to people? How do we convey it? How do we get good insight of it? Should we do questions like we do? Should we kind of go from the ground up, ask people to talk about a fair system and kind of extract what they are saying? Like Karen was mentioning, yes, we need to weigh the data, so we can't really say that these are actual shares in the population until we weight them. But behaviorally, this is still correct information from the models. And we have some challenges there in distinguishing groups, so we need to try to understand if this is tied to people's experiences. And then plurality, what do we do? What do we do about it? So this is my kind of opening to discussion for all of us to think about. If we do acknowledge plurality, how do ideals kind of move up the ladder or get reconciled if people are more progressive than policymakers or vice versa? How do we reconcile that? Who kind of has bigger weights? Can we persuade people? There is some environmental justice literature that suggests, that people can't always form correct opinions or really understand complex, processes of what it means to assign transit to everybody. So if they have poor understanding, or if they are, believe in misinformation, or if there are other challenges, like how do we correct that? This is complex to do as well. So we need to link this to voting behaviors maybe, or support, or protest, or discontent analysis to understand what it means in practice. I would like to expand the idea of fairness to other areas. So do we think, food access, health access, other essential or non-essential goods like leisure should be assigned in the same way? If we look at Marta Nussbaum's work, her right to play is one of the top, 10 rights that people should have, at least a minimum endowment of, right? So it would be interesting to see how this expands across domains. And can we bring these metrics into models that we are using for performance analysis in some ways, or maybe the plurality of metrics? So yeah, lots of questions. I will leave us on a more practical note. As part of the TRB committee, I've been a member of for the last 9 years. The leadership has done a kind of analysis and interviewing people in the field to see what do you think our committee about demand forecasting should be doing. And this is a very recurring theme, which is planners, people that are agency representatives, practitioners, they want to do equity analysis, but they feel like there's very, academic research isn't really useful for getting practical advice and guidance. There's stuff out there, but there's no best practice. Where do you start? There's kind of disagreement. Sorry?
They should do. You can only have best practice if somebody starts doing it, right?
Right, but they.
Stupid argument.
Yeah, right. It might be like a risk-averse or self-defeating argument, but this is what they say about equity research, and this is kind of this is right now a key initiative.
Everybody's waiting for somebody else, basically.
Well, yes. I mean, it's easy to get criticized when you do these things if you do them wrong, right? Or if you don't do it well enough. So I forgot to say this is work by Eric Hong, who's a PhD student in my lab, and Amy Hofstra, who is in the planning department at UIC. So they are also to take merit for this work, and maybe I'll put it back here and see if there are questions.